Throughout human history, across countless civilizations and eras, one question has persistently challenged the minds of philosophers, theologians, and spiritual seekers alike. If God created everything, who created God? This profound inquiry strikes at the very heart of our understanding of existence, causality, and the nature of the divine. The question itself emerges from our human tendency to perceive reality through linear causality, the notion that every effect must have a preceding cause. We observe this pattern in our physical world. A tree grows from a seed, a child is born from parents, a building rises from architectural plans. Our minds naturally seek to extend this chain of causation backward, searching for the first domino that set everything in motion. When we contemplate God as the creator of the universe, we inevitably confront a paradox. If everything requires a creator, then surely the creator must also have been created. Yet, if we accept that God had a creator, we must then ask who created that creator, leading to an infinite regression that offers no satisfactory resolution. This question transcends religious boundaries. In Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, God is portrayed as the eternal, uncreated creator of all things. In Hindu traditions, Brahman is understood as the ultimate reality without beginning or end. Buddhist philosophy explores the concept of dependent origination while questioning the necessity of a first cause. Indigenous spiritual traditions often speak of creator beings whose origins remain shrouded in mystery. The ancient texts provide glimpses into this profound mystery. In the Book of Revelation, God declares, "I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end." The Bhagavad Gita describes the divine as unborn, eternal, ever-existing, and primeval. These passages point toward a reality that exists beyond our conventional understanding of time and causality. Cayce, the renowned American mystic, offered insights that challenge our limited perspectives. Through his remarkable spiritual readings, he suggested that God is not merely a being among beings, but the very ground of being itself, not an entity created at some point in time, but the timeless source from which all creation springs forth. The question of God's origin invites us to recognize the limitations of our human comprehension. Our minds, conditioned by finite experience, struggle to grasp the infinite. We attempt to understand the uncreated through concepts designed for the created, like trying to capture the ocean in a teacup. This mystery is not meant to frustrate us, but to humble and awaken us. It reminds us that the divine reality transcends the boundaries of logical reasoning and invites us into a different mode of knowing, one that embraces paradox rather than resolving it, that welcomes mystery rather than mastering it. When we ask, who created God? We stand at the threshold between the known and the unknowable. We acknowledge that our understanding has reached its limits and that something greater lies beyond. This recognition is not the end of spiritual inquiry, but its true beginning, the point where intellectual reasoning gives way to contemplation, wonder, and reverence. The mystery of divine origin calls us to expand our consciousness beyond its comfortable boundaries. It challenges us to release our need for complete understanding and to open ourselves to a reality that cannot be fully contained within the structures of human thought, but can nevertheless be experienced in the depths of the human heart. The concept of God as an eternal being invites us to transcend our conventional understanding of time, causality, and existence. When we ask who created God, we remain tethered to temporal thinking, the assumption that everything must have a beginning. Yet spiritual wisdom across traditions suggests that the divine exists in a fundamentally different mode of being, one that is not bound by the constraints of time or the necessity of creation. To approach this understanding, we must first recognize how deeply ingrained the concept of linear time is in our consciousness. We experience life as a sequence of moments flowing from past to future. We observe beginnings and endings everywhere, stars being born and dying, civilizations rising and falling, lives commencing and concluding. This conditioning makes it difficult to conceptualize existence without a starting point. Yet, eternity is not simply endless time. It is the transcendence of time itself. When spiritual traditions speak of God as eternal, they are not suggesting that the divine has existed for an infinitely long duration. Rather, They point toward a reality that dwells outside the temporal dimension altogether, a state of being where concepts like before and after lose their meaning. Consider how the ancient Vedic texts describe Brahman as that which was, is, and ever shall be. The Judeo-Christian tradition affirms that before the mountains were brought forth, or the earth and the world were formed, from everlasting to everlasting, thou art God. These are not merely poetic expressions, but attempts to articulate a profound truth about divine nature, that God exists in an eternal now, a perpetual present that encompasses all times without being contained by time. This understanding of divine eternity addresses the question of God's origin by transcending it. If God exists beyond time, then the question of when or how God came to be becomes meaningless. It would be like asking what lies north of the North Pole. The question itself contains assumptions that do not apply to the reality it seeks to probe. The eternal nature of the divine also illuminates our understanding of creation. Rather than imagining God as a being who existed in time and then decided to create the universe at a particular moment, we might consider creation as the continuous emanation of divine being, not an event that happened long ago, but an ongoing process through which timeless reality manifests in temporal forms. This perspective was eloquently expressed in the spiritual readings of Cayce, who described God not as a separate entity who created the universe from outside, but as the very ground of being itself, the source and substance of all that is. In this understanding, creation is not something God did, but something God is doing, an eternal expression of divine nature, rather than a discrete act with a beginning point. The eternal nature of God also invites us to reconsider our own relationship with time. If our deepest essence is connected to the divine, then perhaps we too participate in eternity even as we journey through temporal existence. Perhaps our souls, like ripples on the ocean of divine consciousness, share in the timeless quality of their source. When we contemplate God's eternal nature, we begin to see that the divine is not simply the first link in a causal chain, but the very chain itself, not merely the answer to our questions about origins, but the ground from which those questions arise. The divine is not an object to be understood, but the very capacity for understanding. Not a being among beings, but being itself. This shift in perspective does not eliminate mystery, but transforms our relationship with it. Instead of seeing the question of God's origin as a problem to be solved, we recognize it as a doorway to deeper awareness, an invitation to release our attachment to linear causality and to open ourselves to a more expansive understanding of reality. In the eternal nature of the divine, we discover not an escape from existence, but its fulfillment, not a rejection of our human experience, but its deepest context. We find ourselves held within a reality that has no beginning or end, a reality that does not need to be created because it simply, eternally is. The mystical traditions of the world offer profound insights into the nature of divinity that transcend intellectual understanding. Where philosophy seeks to analyze and theology attempts to explain, mysticism invites direct experience of the divine reality. From this experiential perspective, the question, who created God, reveals itself not as a puzzle demanding solution, but as a gateway to transformation. Mystics across traditions have consistently testified that God is not a created being, but the primordial source from which all manifestation arises. This understanding comes not through logical deduction, but through direct communion with the divine presence. In moments of mystical awakening, the barriers between knower and known dissolve, revealing a unity that precedes all differentiation. Within this unity, the question of God's origin becomes self-referential, like asking how existence itself came to exist. The Sufi mystic Rumi captured this paradox when he wrote, "I searched for God and found only myself. I searched for myself and found only God." Jian. This poetic insight points to the mystical recognition that the divine is not an entity separate from creation, but the very substance of reality. The creator and the created are ultimately expressions of the same uncreated source, different aspects of a seamless whole rather than separate links in a causal chain. In the Jewish mystical tradition of Kabbalah, God's essence is described as Ein Sof, the infinite without end, the boundless nothingness that contains all potentiality. Ein Sof is understood not as a being that came into existence, but as the formless ground of being that transcends existence and non-existence alike. From this primordial reality emerges the structured manifestation of divine attributes, but the source itself remains eternally beyond creation. Christian mysticism similarly speaks of God as the ground of being, or the isness that underlies all created forms. Meister Eckhart, the medieval mystic, distinguished between God, the divine as conceived by human minds, and the Godhead, the inconceivable source beyond all mental constructs. The Godhead, he suggested, is not created, but eternally generates itself, a perpetual self-origination that transcends temporal beginning. Eastern traditions offer complementary insights. In Advaita Vedanta, Brahman is understood not as a creator god, but as the absolute reality that is both immanent in and transcendent to all manifestation. The Upanishads declare Tat Tvam Asi, that thou art, pointing to the ultimate identity between individual consciousness and cosmic consciousness. From this non-dual perspective, asking who created God would be like a wave asking who created the ocean. Zen Buddhism approaches the question through radical simplicity, cutting through conceptual elaboration to point directly at reality as it is. When a monk asked Zen master Joshu about the ultimate nature of reality, Joshu replied, "The cypress tree in the courtyard." This response bypasses intellectual speculation to indicate that the uncreated source is not hidden behind manifestation, but fully present within it. Cayce's mystical insights align with these perennial understandings. Through his remarkable readings, he described the divine not as a being created in time, but as the timeless I am, the self-existent awareness that precedes all form. This resonates with the biblical passage, where God identifies to Moses simply as I am that I am, suggesting an essence that is self-originated, self-sustained, and self-defined. The mystical perspective invites us beyond the limitations of causal thinking into a more intuitive apprehension of reality. It suggests that the divine is not an object to be explained, but the very context within which all explanation takes place. Not a link in the chain of causation, but the space in which causation unfolds. This shift from explanatory thinking to contemplative awareness transforms our relationship with mystery. Instead of trying to resolve the paradox of divine origin, we are invited to enter fully into it, to allow its tensions to expand our consciousness beyond conventional boundaries. The question becomes not a problem awaiting solution, but a koan that disrupts our habitual patterns of thought and opens us to deeper modes of knowing. Through mystical insight, we discover that God is not created but eternally creative, not a static entity established at some point in cosmic history, but a dynamic presence continually generating itself and all reality. The divine is the ever-present origin, the perpetual beginning that requires no anterior cause, because it is itself the ground of all causality. The question of divine origin exists at the fascinating intersection where science and spirituality meet, sometimes in harmonious dialogue, sometimes in apparent contradiction. Both domains seek to understand ultimate reality, yet they approach this quest through different methodologies and conceptual frameworks. Exploring their convergence and divergence can illuminate our understanding of the uncreated creator. Modern science has revolutionized our understanding of cosmic origins through theories like the Big Bang, which suggests that our universe began approximately 13.8 billion years ago from an incredibly dense and hot singularity. This scientific narrative presents a compelling account of how the physical universe as we know it came into being. Yet even this sophisticated explanation eventually encounters its own boundary, the question of what preceded the Big Bang and what caused it to occur. Physicists and cosmologists continue to probe this frontier, developing hypotheses about quantum fluctuations, multiverse theories, and cyclic cosmological models. Yet each new theoretical advance tends to push the question of ultimate origins further back, rather than resolving it completely. Science excels at explaining how natural processes unfold within the universe, but faces inherent limitations when addressing what might transcend the universe itself. Renowned physicist Stephen Hawking acknowledged this boundary when he asked, What is it that breathes fire into the equations and makes a universe for them to describe? This poignant query recognizes that even the most elegant mathematical models cannot fully account for their own existence or explain why there is something rather than nothing. The spiritual perspective approaches these questions differently. While science seeks an initial cause within the framework of natural processes, spiritual traditions point to a transcendent reality that exists beyond the parameters of physical causality altogether. God, in this understanding, is not the first event in a temporal sequence, but the eternal ground from which all temporal sequences arise. This distinction highlights a fundamental difference in how science and spirituality conceptualize causation. Science typically works with efficient causality, identifying the preceding conditions and mechanisms that produce particular effects. Spirituality, especially in its mystical expressions, often emphasizes formal and final causality, the patterns or purposes that give shape and meaning to existence. When spiritual traditions speak of God as uncreated, they are not making an arbitrary exception to causality, but recognizing a different order of reality, one that is not subject to the same laws that govern physical phenomena. The divine is understood not as an entity within the cosmos, but as the very possibility of cosmos itself, not a being that began to exist, but the foundation of existence itself. This perspective was articulated by philosopher Paul Tillich, who described God not as a being, but as being itself, the power of being that enables all particular beings to exist. Similarly, the medieval theologian Thomas Aquinas distinguished between beings whose essence involves existence, created things, and the being whose essence is existence itself, God. For Aquinas, God is not a thing that exists, but existence itself, not a reality that needs to be created because it is the very act of creation. Cayce's insights bridge these scientific and spiritual understandings. His readings suggested that the physical universe emerges from subtler dimensions of consciousness and energy, that matter itself is ultimately a crystallization of thought patterns within divine mind. This perspective offers a potential integration where physical processes studied by science can be understood as manifestations of deeper metaphysical principles. This integrative approach invites us to see science and spirituality not as competing explanations, but as complementary modes of inquiry operating at different levels of reality. Science explores the mechanisms through which the universe functions, while spirituality addresses the meaning and purpose that infuse those mechanisms with significance. The question, who created God, thus becomes an opportunity for deeper dialogue rather than conflict. It challenges both scientific materialism, which may dismiss the question as meaningless, and simplistic religious literalism, which may avoid the question altogether. It calls us to a more nuanced understanding that honors both the empirical rigor of science and the experiential depth of spiritual wisdom. Perhaps most importantly, this question reminds us of the humility appropriate to all human knowing. Both scientific and spiritual traditions, at their most profound, acknowledge the mystery that ultimately surrounds existence. The physicist confronting the enigma of quantum indeterminacy and the mystic encountering the ineffable divine are both standing at the threshold of the unknown, not with answers that close inquiry, but with wonder that keeps it open. As we contemplate the uncreated creator, we are invited to hold this paradox with reverence rather than frustration. The question of divine origin may not find resolution within the boundaries of human comprehension, but its very unresolvability points toward a reality greater than our conceptual frameworks can contain, a reality that does not need explanation, because it is itself the source from which all explanation flows. In this contemplative space, the clash between science and faith transforms into a creative tension that expands our consciousness. We discover that the truest response to the mystery of divine origin may not be a definitive answer, but a deepening capacity for awe, a recognition that we ourselves participate in the very mystery we seek to understand. If these insights about the eternal nature of the divine have resonated with you, I invite you to continue this spiritual exploration together. Subscribe to this channel for more profound reflections that bridge ancient wisdom with contemporary understanding. Share your own thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Your perspective enriches our collective journey towards deeper awareness. Let's build a community of seekers who aren't afraid to ask the most challenging questions about existence. Subscribe now and join the conversation.